Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm GiGi, still flying solo. We are going to jump right in. So, one thing today would have been the 52nd birthday of Tammy Daybell. And I tweeted out a little message, tagged the foundation in. We got a really sweet message back. It said, "Thank you. We deeply miss her, and we are dedicating this day to working in her memory." I thought that was really, really sweet. They have a foundation that provides books to children and um, Tammy had a passion for animals and children reading. So I think it's really wonderful that they've taken her memory and are using something that will make a difference in a lot of kids' lives. So it was nice to get a response from them today, and I have thought about her all day. Just such a beautiful lady. Her smile was very radiant, and it's just really sad what happened to her. So, moving on, today is day 6 that Casey White and Vicky White have been on the run. So, on last night's episode, remember I told you that she sold her house April 18th, just a few weeks ago, for $95,550. But the Lauderdale County's home listing for that, the total parcel value was $204,700. So she took a quick pay to get some cash on hand, probably so they wouldn't have to use credit cards. And God knows where they are right now because there have been no sightings. And also, the if you're on YouTube, starting to integrate some graphics into it so you don't have to just stare at me and Fruit Loop. The U.S. Marshals have put together 2 example images to identify the height difference between Casey White and Vicky White in relation to each other, as well as the vehicle they are believed to be driving. So he's tall. He is 90 inches, and that's 6'9". Oh, I'm sorry. That's 80 inches. Look, math and me, we don't work. In other words, he's a lot taller than her. She's a half pint, just like me. And so if you see somebody walking with somebody much, much shorter, take a double look. All right. The other thing, I'm going to go back to this. The other thing is that she's no longer employed with the sheriff's office. She was terminated, which means she won't get that pension, which she's not going to get it anyway because she's going to get arrested. Arrest warrant out for her now. And they say their relationship may have began in 2020 when he was brought from prison back to the Lauderdale jail for arraignment in the murder of 58-year-old Connie Ridgway. We talked about that last night. It was a cold case. He confessed, then changed and said he was pleading not guilty by reason of mental illness. So he was awaiting trial for that. And he was getting some privileges from Vicky in jail. He was getting extra food on his tray and was getting privileges they say no one else got. And this was all coming from her. So we won't speculate what kind of privileges he might have been getting, but you know how it goes. All right, moving on. Quick Murdaugh news. Some big indictments came down. Russell Lafitte, who was the CEO of Palmetto Bank, was charged with criminal conspiracy and a bunch of other additional fraud charges as part of just the superseding indictment tied to those earlier indictments against Alex. And he was fired back in January as the CEO of this bank. And Alex's college buddy, Corey Fleming, 5 new charges for him, 4 new charges for Alex. So just keeps rolling, rolling, rolling. Here's a picture of the 3 of them on the opposite side of the law now. It must be a little weird. You have to wonder during all this. I don't think we're done with all these financial charges nor murder charges. There's 4 dead bodies around this man. And Fitz News has put out some stuff saying that they may have gotten a tip that indicates he was there at the time of the murder. And we fully believe at some point he'll be charged for that. All right. So we're going to jump into the Wagner hearing because I'm going to tell you right now, this trial I am looking forward to because this case is almost as intriguing to me as Vallow Daybell in a different way, just because of the brazen murders that they committed all in one night. The family of 4, Billy Wagner, the dad, Angela Wagner, the mother, George Wagner, the 4th, and Jake Wagner, all arrested. Jake and his mother both have confessed. Jake confessed to five of the eight murders, as well as a bunch of other charges. Angela essentially was the mastermind behind all this. She pled guilty and got 30 years in prison. The deal is if Jake testifies to the satisfaction of the prosecution, then the death penalty will be removed for all four of the Wagners. Won't be for Angela, but she wasn't. I don't think she had death on the table, or maybe she did. So, anyways, let's go through some of the new little nuggets we learned at this hearing. And it was held on Monday, and it was actually 6 years on April 22nd that these murders took place. And so, again, when we say the long road to justice, a case like this, where you've had immediate family members who have passed away since the murders, never saw justice. It's been in and out of court, 2 years for them to get arrested, as you know. Right now, George the Fourth, his trial is tentatively scheduled to start August 29th. I don't think many people are confident that will actually happen, but we will see. So, out of the gate, the defense wants the jury to be instructed to take Jake and Angela's testimony with great caution. As you guys know, they are accused of killing seven members of the Roden family and Hannah Gilley, who was engaged to Frankie Roden in one night. And they argued also for a change of venue, saying this is the biggest case really in the community, maybe even the state's history. And he said even the governor watched Jake plead guilty. And he said, when has that ever happened? He argued that a lot of information, especially what's on social media in groups, is wrong and could impact jury selection locally. And the prosecution said George didn't request a change of venue until January of this year after Jake pled guilty. So the judge denied the request and said they're going to have it there. It looks like the prosecution is going to call about 308 witnesses. That's a lot. The state is using some informants, and some have been disclosed to the defense and some have not. The defense are saying that they do not have contact information of some of these informants. And the defense says they're entitled to any benefits informants may have received in cooperating with authorities. The defense also wants to interview Jake's ex-wife, Elizabeth. Now, she was from Alaska. So after the homicides, they moved to Alaska with the two minor children, and Jake got married to this woman named Elizabeth. The defense says they have not been provided with her contact information. So she is someone on that informant list, and she fled for her life when she left the Wagner home. And the prosecutor even tried to get her social security number changed for a new identity due to her fear of harm from the Wagners. And the prosecutor said giving her contact information could be risky for her life, but the defense has been provided a copy of her testimony. The Wagners accused George's girlfriend, Tabitha, of trying to poison them with food. They also tried to accuse Jake's Alaska wife, Elizabeth, of poisoning them with food. And the prosecutor said George is part of a criminal enterprise. They say they have conversations between George and Jake, and they acknowledge now they wired this truck that Jake and George would drive cross country to make deliveries. And they acknowledged that they could be being recorded while they're going down the road, and that investigators might be listening to them. And they said they did mix things up in case that was the case, which it was. And the prosecutor said this family functioned as one unit to achieve their goals. Part of the control was over George's son and Jake and Hannah's daughter, Sophia, and also the child that wasn't his. The family was very insular. They shared finances. The boys were homeschooled. They would decide who had the best credit. They would get a house in that person's name. And in fact, they tried to get a house after the homicides, but they committed mortgage fraud in doing that by providing false information. And they said that all of their decisions, whether big or small, were made by taking family votes. They controlled Elizabeth, the Alaska wife, who moved back to Ohio with them, by the way, when they came back. They controlled even down to which room she would stay in when she was living with them, where they would live. And this is so weird, but Angela involved herself in George and Tabitha's intimate relations. And the same thing with Jake and Elizabeth, the Alaska wife. Nothing was off limits to the family to discuss, and everything was done as a unit. Not one of them went off and did their own thing. They talked a little bit about domestic violence towards Hannah when she was living with the Wagners, and Jake did admit to pushing her against a wall and having his arm in a position that choked her airway. And Hannah also expressed this in text messages to other people. And Jake was witnessed chasing her in a vehicle after they had an argument. So, moving on to intent and motive, Jake dictated everything regarding Hannah and their child, Sophia, which, for those of you that are new to the case, we have a whole bunch of episodes that we've done in the past with backstories on this family. So, please go catch up. It's an interesting case, and we will be all over this when it goes to trial. So, they say that the control started when Hannah was pregnant, and Jake demanded that his family care for Sophia if she was not with Hannah, and he wanted her to be homeschooled like him, and that Jake would make every decision regarding Sophia. And the control and those demands continued up until Hannah was murdered. His controlling behavior continued with Hannah's second child. Now remember, this is not Jake's biological child. He demanded that Hannah not disclose the identity of the second child's actual father to him, and offered money for her to put his name on that child's birth certificate. And he was trying to convince her to move to Alaska and raise Hannah's new baby together as if it were Jake's. So there was a belief that Jake couldn't have children with anyone else because a new child might feel slighted. And when Hannah lived with the Wagners, they would limit her contact with her own family and would only let her reach out every so often. And she was allowed to call her mother on her birthday and Mother's Day. But towards the end, when Hannah moved out, there were instances of Jake's going to Hannah's house to do what prosecutors alleged to be scoping out a layout of that residence. One residence had been recently moved into. I do believe that was Dana Roden and little Chris. She had separated from Chris Sr. and moved to a trailer just down the road. I assume that's what they're talking about. And another residence was actually one that Jake had lived in, and he would ask them a lot of questions about locks on the doors. So during one of these scoping missions, George IV was waiting outside in the car. And when he got in the car, there were conversations about leaving quickly before other family members showed up and caught them. Jake was insanely jealous of Hannah's relationship with Charlie Gilley, who was the father of her new baby and also the brother of the non-rodent victim, Hanna Gilley. And at the panel for the Pike County Massacre podcast with Joseph Scott Morgan, they said that Hannah had, I believe, 5 shots to the face were her injuries, and they wondered, why would she get so many? And then they theorized, is it that connection that Hanna Gilley's brother was with Hannah and they had a child together? And it kind of makes sense. He wanted to get back together with her, and then he tried to get her to agree to shared custody of Sophia, which is reminiscent of what George IV did with the mother of his child, Tabitha. They made her sign a full custody agreement of their son over to George, with the agreement that Tabitha could visit the child only when the Wagners said she could, and only if the visitation was supervised by one of the Wagners. The prosecutor said ultimately she was rarely allowed to see her son. And Hanna Mae knew this. She knew what was going on. She was inboxing with Tabitha, and they were comparing horror stories essentially of the Wagner family. So in December 2015, conversations Hannah had with Tabitha's mother, who warned Hannah not to fall into the same pitfalls that Tabitha did. Hannah said the Wagners, as we know, would have to kill her before she signed over custody to them. And Jake acknowledged that when Angela read that message, that was when the motive for the murders were born. And there were conversations the night of the murders, just hours before Hannah was murdered, Hanna Mae, between Tabitha and Hanna Mae, where they recalled Tabitha's last day in the Wagner home. And Hannah was present for this. She was there, where they had threatened to get a gun to use on Tabitha. And this is when she fled the house and hid in a barn until dark. And then she got on a bicycle and rode to a convenience store out of fear for her life. And Hannah told Tabitha she thought they would have killed her if she had not gotten away that night. And this all stems back to an argument over the minor child that Tabitha and George the Fourth shared. There was a very weird obsession with these grandkids, with Angela specifically. The prosecution said the Wagners had a unique playbook they would use when women would come into George and Jake's lives. And as we know, the Wagners spied on Hanna through her social media, and others had other people who lived nearby spy on Hanna when she had Sophia in her custody, seeing if there were any other men coming to the house. And if there were, they would report that to the Wagners. So Angela admitted she was the one who hacked the social media accounts. And the reason she said she was spying on Tabitha's social media is because she was starting to hear rumors that Tabitha was planning on taking the Wagners to court to get standard visitation with her son. So Angela would hack her Facebook to try and get damaging information against Tabitha to prevent her from getting any visitation rights at all. This is how they happened to see that communication with Tabitha's mother, and Hanna Mae. And 4 months later, after that message was seen, was when the murders took place. So Jake and Angela have admitted to a lot of stuff, and some of these things that we're talking about now have come from their admitting to the crimes. So Jake and Angela admitted part of the motive was to get custody of Sophia. And also, they thought someone in Hannah's family or someone close to her may abuse Sophia, whether physically or sexually. And this was essentially, as far as we know, a very made up allegation, just something they created in their head to, I guess, make themselves feel better about being mass murderers. But Jake recorded conversations with Hanna prior to those murders. And there's also talk of how Angela wants to raise Jake and Hannah's baby as her own. And Jake actually gets mad at Hanna when she doesn't agree to this. And Hanna expresses how the Wagners want Sophia to refer to Angela as mother and not refer to Hanna Mae as mother. So it's the same theme that happened with Tabitha. It was almost the same argument as far as how this all played out. The prosecution says Hanna Mae was the intended target in these murders. Other acts relating to Tabitha, George IV's ex-girlfriend, they accused her of being physically abusive to her child. They accused her of trying to poison them with food. They also isolated her from her family, and they did get custody of the younger son under false pretenses. And how they did that was they told Hanna that the signing of custody was only temporary until she got a place of her own. Then they tried to avoid letting Hanna see the baby so that a year later they could claim abandonment, and then she would never have legal rights to that child again. They also had people spying on Tabitha, and they would even get Hanna Mae to try to report to them anything Tabitha said about the Wagners or the baby. We learned that Jake once threatened to kill Hanna and told her her body would never be found. So, moving on to the Alaska wife of Jake, Elizabeth, she moved to Ohio with them and lived with Angela, Jake, George, and the two minor children. They had taken them after the murders. Um, when they moved back to Ohio, Billy actually lived with his mother, Frederica. She was charged with some, I think it was obstruction of justice. I'm not exactly sure, but that went away. The same pattern with her, controlled her movements. On their wedding night, before the marriage was consummated, Jake demanded her passwords. On their wedding night, guys. I mean, ha it blows my mind. If I were her, as soon as he snoozed, I would have ran. They also put tracking devices on her phone, and they talked about this in the recorded conversations that investigators got. And they accused Elizabeth of being physically and sexually abusive with one of the children, also accused of trying to poison them with food. And she started to become suspicious because she had heard from the Wagners that Tabitha had allegedly done the same thing. And so at this point, Elizabeth became very concerned for her own well-being. So Jake and Angela confronted her in the kitchen. This is where they had family meetings, apparently. The prosecutor said most of the family meetings took place in the kitchen. And they had this meeting because Angela said the child claimed that Elizabeth had sexually abused them. Jake told her if he learned she had sexually abused the child, he would beat her with a bat. And if he didn't, his dad or his brother would. At one point in the conversation, the state has on record when they bugged the truck that Jake and George were driving cross country, Jake said Elizabeth could not tell her family where she lived, or he would have to kill them if they came around at this point, that now was not a good time. And I believe at this point, the investigation was really starting to heat up about the Wagners. It seemed like the Wagners knew they were onto them. And when Jake's child, Sophia, Jake and Hanna Mae's child, started referring to Elizabeth as mom, Angela and George were really upset with Jake for allowing the child to call her that. The concern was that George was afraid it would make his son question everything because his son was calling Angela mom, apparently. And this was apparently a big source of arguments between Jake, George, and Angela. These are recorded. This is why I cannot wait for trial if this stuff comes in. All this stuff essentially is prior bad acts that the prosecution wants to bring in, and the defense is arguing against it. They went through Elizabeth's personal items and found a notebook where she was writing down examples of their controlling nature and how they share finances. And she was frustrated that Jake's money was not his own. There were also conversations with Elizabeth about the time and manner of hers and Jake's sexual relations. So it seems like Angela would dictate where and when and how they would have sex, which is just, oh Lord, we're just going to skip that. We can all talk about how screwed up that is. They also hired a private investigator to trail her. The prosecutor said all this stuff is recorded. So George and Angela decide that Elizabeth has to go, and saying she is a danger to the family and to Sophia. And at one point, George says that he himself cares for Sophia more than Jake does. And he said, I thought everything we did was for Sophia's benefit, which I assume is the murders. He said Jake treats Sophia like a second-class citizen. And he said that Jake would hug Elizabeth, his wife, before he would hug Sophia. And at one point, they thought she was a BCI agent. So they thought his wife was, they're very paranoid. And I guess they would be at this point. It's pretty clear investigators are hot on their trail. Ultimately, they have a family meeting. And guess what? They decide, you guys got to break up. Jake did not want to break up with her, but ultimately, I guess it's a majority rules family, and he did. The prosecutor also said they have high levels of proof the Wagners were suspected in several arsons of various properties for financial gain. Everyone in the conspiracy had their own rule, and they carried out their own rule. Angela puts herself away from the crime itself. And the prosecutor said they all have a cover-up story that they had concocted. She cites case law of claims of innocence but presence, which means George is saying, yes, I was there. No, I didn't shoot anybody. And she said because he claims this, it opens the door to allow these prior bad acts to be entered into the trial. They also say Jake was preparing to teach Sophia in the way of the family and how he was raised and raised her that way. The prosecutor gave the example of how the boys were taught to steal gas from trucks, saying this was a family affair. So she really was alluding to the fact that they must have on conversation that Jake intended to raise Sophia as he was raised. There were a few prior acts she said they would not pursue due to lack of evidence. She didn't say what they were. So this is interesting. I didn't know this. On the night of the homicides, they set up a fake drug deal to give them access to Chris Sr. So this allowed Billy to drive up to the residence that night. And the prosecutor said this drug deal was very lucrative. So we knew that Chris likely was alive when he was murdered based on some of the forensic evidence. And I'm sure we'll learn more about that. But now it makes sense. He didn't just bust up in there and catch him awake. He was invited over because under this fake drug deal that would have been very good. Jake and George were there, but they hid in a truck that they had bought and modified specifically for this murder, and they called it the murder truck. They stayed in there not to be seen, and we really don't know what happens after that. They had other people commit perjury and obstruction of justice. They were heard talking on the wire to others in the family and extended family. I believe her mother, Billy's mother, Frederica. And they have information from Jake that Angela said she bought the shoes for Jake and George. and Jake admitted they wore them the night of the homicide. Just recently, they ruled this shoe print evidence could come in. She's on surveillance at Walmart buying the shoes, and I believe there is a receipt they found for that. They had witnesses who were going to do them a favor and testify the shoes were not bought for that purpose. But with the admission, it kind of makes their they might not want to get up there and perjure themselves. At this point, the judge interrupts the prosecutor and asks if the visit from Billy Wagner was expected by Chris Sr. the night of the homicide. And then she recounts the fake drug deal. Jake and George were hidden, as we know, but the judge seemed a little baffled to me about that. It was, minutes later, and it kind of popped back in his head, and then he addressed it. So how they with the fake drug deal, the story that Billy was giving investigators after the murders, obviously when he's being questioned, he named somebody who he said probably murdered Chris Sr. for cutting him out of this fake drug deal. That was the story or the theory that he tried to use to take a little heat off of him and his family. They asked Rita Newcomb, which is Angela's mother, to lie to the grand jury and investigators about notarizing those custody papers. If you remember, they forged Hanna Mae's name. Jake and George were the ones who came up with the idea, according to Angela. And this was in case the boys were killed or arrested on the night of the murders. They have recordings where the boys told others not to talk to investigators and also encouraged them to ignore subpoenas. They hired attorneys for witnesses and accompanied them to the lawyer's office and kept doing this kind of influential stuff after their arrest. She didn't elaborate. Don't know if it was jailhouse calls, emails, or what. But she did say that a lot of the violence, the threats of violence, came from George towards the sheriff and law enforcement. They have that on audio. Elizabeth Wagner would testify that she heard them say if some of them were arrested and not others, they had plans of how they would bust the ones that were incarcerated out of jail. All four defendants, I said dependents, they are codependent co-defendants. So it's not wrong. How they all four participated in those conversations. So there was a family vote of whether to commit the murders, and everyone said yes. The judge asked for clarification that an actual vote took place and also asked again about the escape plan, if some were arrested but not all. She confirmed that the vote happened and they also had plans in place to bust somebody out. George paid for the vehicle that was bought specifically and used the night of the murders, and they called it the murder truck. They did this so nobody would recognize them. And the judge asked if it would be better to have people come testify to these bad acts as opposed to having, I guess, transcripts. And the prosecutor said Jake and Angela will testify to this. Seems like maybe the judge was a little bit worried that this could be prejudicial to the jury in some ways. He did not rule on this stuff. I'm keeping an eye out, but that's it. Crazy case, y'all. I'm actually going to go back and watch that Pike County Massacre documentary that's on Oxygen. It was the best one. Just a good refresher. All right, guys, if anything happens with Casey and Vicky White, I will let you know. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow. Don't forget, next week, starting Monday, I will be in the courtroom for the Ariel Robinson murder trial. She is accused of murdering Victoria Rose Smith, her foster child. Ariel was like the season 20 winner of a show called Worst Cooks in America. It's going to get a lot of national coverage, and I do have a guaranteed seat, so I'm really glad I get to sit in and hopefully talk to the family. I've talked to them some. Sweet, sweet people, very devastated, as you can imagine. So lots coming up next week, guys. Going to be busy, busy. All right, have a good rest of your night. We'll